go. Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Siviwe Kwagube. I'm the DA's national spokesperson. And this morning I am joined by the DA Head of Policy, Gwen Ngwenya. I'm joined also by the DA Shadow Minister of Public Enterprises, Khaleb Kachalia, and the DA Shadow Minister of Energy, Kevin Milam. The press conference is going to run pretty simply. Once we have run through the different inputs by the different panelists, we will then take questions from both in the room but also from our online platform. South Africa has been plagued by a cost of living crisis, which has been underscored by a low growth economy that does not create jobs. As a result, millions of South Africans are basically being crushed under the yoke of poverty and unemployment. The rising cost of fuel and the job destroying blackouts contribute to this reality that many people face. That is why it is deeply unfortunate that the solutions that the DA has put forward and continues to put forward to create or at least bring about cheap electricity and fuel and end load shedding have sometimes been ignored by the ANC government because of their commitments to their ideological battles. It is also quite telling for us that the ANC policy conference this weekend was mostly about leadership contests and the step-aside policy instead of being about the real issues that are facing South Africans today. And that is why the launch of this policy this morning is very important, because it's not just our obligation as official opposition, but it's also our obligation as a party that is in government in many parts of the country. And so I'm going to call up Gwen to take us through what are the key tenets of this policy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Siviwe. The DA is outlining its energy and electricity policy today in an environment where there have been numerous research papers and discussion documents on energy policy. And these documents have been charting South Africa's challenges and how to address them. The purpose, therefore, of today is not to compete with expert recommendations, but to provide policy direction so that it is clear that when we do look at technical prescriptions, which we should adopt as a country that help to move us closer towards our public policy goals. The trouble, of course, at present is that it is difficult to know which technical prescriptions fit together and in which direction the country is pulling when the ANC-led government has been unable to sing from the same hymn sheet. The broad goals of the DA's energy policy are to achieve cheap electricity and fuel, to end load shedding, and to secure an environment for future generations. This essentially is what is necessary in order to have a socio-economic environment that furthers South Africa's development and prosperity. The policy proposals that achieve this mirror and bring together what the DA has been calling for a very long time, and also mirrors our actions where we govern. So you will find a clear thread linking together the party's policy positions, what our shadow ministers communicate in Parliament, and what DA leaders in government are doing. This is in stark contrast to the uncoordinated chaos that has been emanating from the President, ministers in his cabinet, and the ANC National Policy Conference. Ironically, the ANC's conference documents make mention of various coalition governments who they claim have little more in common than drunkards in a beer hall. This, however, seems to be far more fitting of a description of the President vis-à-vis his own cabinet. As a result of their discord, the President and his ministers have been presiding over expensive and rising electricity and fuel prices, rolling blackouts, as well as widespread environmental and economic losses. We recognize that tabling a policy in this environment, where a great deal is already being said and to a lesser extent being done, requires us to explain clearly how our policy approach differs from what is already being said and done. So I want to outline now the DA's approach and that of the ANC, and to outline how they fundamentally differ. Firstly, the DA's approach is consumer-centric. In other words, we are focused on delivering cheap, reliable and sustainable energy. The ANC, on the other hand, has been concerned with doing what is best for the ANC and its outdated ideological agenda. Secondly, through our proposals, we seek to champion access to electricity for all by supporting self-generation for all households across the income spectrum and ensuring full coverage of free basic electricity for all indigent households, where currently a great number have been underserved. And this contributes, of course, to the many illegal connections that we see. Legal, free basic electricity for those who qualify is better for households and the electricity system than illegal connections. Thus far, under the ANC, less than 30% of indigent South Africans receive free basic electricity, even though the taxpayer is funding it. So municipalities must reveal how much they receive from Treasury to fund free basic electricity versus how much is actually spent by municipalities on free basic electricity. In addition, many households too have been left to fend for themselves in installing expensive self-generation solutions. Thirdly, a key difference is that the DA takes a whole of society approach, meaning that we do not arrogantly view the government, including any DA-run government, as the sole or most important stakeholder in resolving the energy crisis. Instead, we bring in the ingenuity of people, of communities, of organizations which lie outside the DA universe in addressing the energy crisis. For example, this means an openness to making room for prosumers. These are consumers of electricity who are also producing electricity, as well as making increased room for the private sector, as well as seeking out and actually using expert advice. This is an entirely different approach to that which characterizes the current national approach. Eskom 2.0, or the second Eskom proposal, reflects a government that is constantly navel-gazing and unable to look beyond its own universe for solutions. We are committed to deregulation and making it easier to do business. This means that in electricity and fuel markets, we are committed to making it easier for a competitive market to emerge that will result in cheaper prices for consumers. This, of course, requires a meaningful unbundling and privatization of Eskom, and this is critical for reliability and putting an end to load shedding, which Khaled will further add details to. This, of course, is in contrast to the existing environment of fuel price controls and excessive red tape. Fifthly, we have also taken a very strong commitment on our climate commitments. We want the country's nationally determined contributions to be made far more ambitious in order to keep our fair share, to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. The present reality is that South Africa still has relatively weak climate commitments, and our NDCs are not enough to keep global warming below the agreed level. This policy is absolutely clear that nobody must be left behind as we embrace the future. A transition of this magnitude requires thinking on how to ensure that the transition is inclusive. There is no point in trying to push against the inevitable, as some ANC ministers have been trying to do. Protectionist measures, whilst they may seem popular today with workers, are in fact unsustainable and irresponsible, as they are trying to cling to the past and to cling to a fossil fuel-based economy whose heyday is now well beyond, or rather well in South Africa's rearview mirror. And lastly, we differ, as mentioned, in our ability to provide policy certainty, whereas the ANC has seemed to excel in sowing confusion. The DA's leadership and policy thinking are pulling quite clearly in the same direction. This is evident in alignment where it matters between the DA's party pronouncements and what we do where we govern. This lends itself far more to confidence and is conducive to effective implementation. Examples include recent announcements around consumers being able to receive credit for electricity they put into the grid, which is a position the DA has long called for and is now being implemented in the city of Cape Town. Furthermore, we have constantly applied pressure for there to be a tax rebate for solar installations, something which our mayors are also adding pressure to see that materialize. So there's this constant unity between what is being said in the party, what we attempt to do in government, and what is being said in Parliament as represented by shadow ministers. The President, ministers, ANC, etc. all issue contradictory statements. In such an environment, investors are quite clear that there can be no predictability and confidence about the future, and therefore few investments. While putting the DA in national government would be the most obvious way to inject much-needed political leadership and policy certainty, the President can take steps to turn his ship around and provide clear, unambiguous leadership by doing some of the following. Firstly, establishing a dedicated energy ministry separated from mineral resources to place focus on a sound, forward-looking energy policy that helps to address South Africa's past challenges and prepare South Africa for the future. There should also be an immediate review of all existing energy policies, regulations and legislation to help streamline and remove barriers that provide a stumbling block to implementation. The Minister of Energy should also establish a ministerial advisory council on energy that brings together the very best minds on energy in the country, including academics, financiers, business leaders, municipal leaders, organized labor and civil society, to advise and guide the Minister on an implementation of energy and electricity policies. And then in consultation with the Advisory Council to finalize without delay a comprehensive national integrated energy plan that considers all of South Africa's primary energy resources and energy carriers. Finally, electricity policy updating has been infrequent, with 7 years between the publishing in 2011 of an integrated resource plan and the updating in 2019 that covers the decade to 2030. The IRP should be reviewed and updated on a regular basis to reflect changes in economic conditions, consumer demands, and technology. Khaleb and then Kevin will now follow up on this outline of our key policy choices with more detailed proposals that then start to provide meat onto the framework and bones that I've just provided. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Allow me to address the Eskom and electricity specific issues in our policy position, a copy of which has been released and should be in your inboxes as I speak. It is important to recognize that this policy document comes at a time when we are beset with a crisis in the electricity sector, a crisis parallel to none, and in Eskom specifically. And while as such, while we recognize that our longer-term plans will be influenced by the success of shorter-term measures employed to deal with the immediate and ongoing risk and reality of load shedding, our ambition for South Africa is that energy should come from renewable sources in the long term as far as possible. Eskom is the primary generator of electricity, is beset by an apparent inability to fix its fleet and plug short-term needs while longer-term solutions are put in place. This must be addressed with urgency to bring the load shedding of some 15 years duration to an end. Maintenance is of the essence, and if addressed with the appropriate skills, finance, and partnerships, the immediate problem can be dealt with. But therein lies the issue. The immediate and short-term electricity needs must, however, be addressed by a plan that addresses the reliability of supply within existing parameters in the most cost-effective and source-agnostic manner. In parallel, additional and alternative measures must be addressed for energy security now and in the future. Eskom's mandate, after all, is to provide affordable and available electricity, neither of which it does. From an immediate Eskom viewpoint, everything needs to be geared to the fixing, augmentation and opening up of generation capacity within Eskom to allow the 17,000 megawatts that is broken down and not being brought online, that would, if only half of that were fixed, banish load shedding. This would allow parallel steps to be taken outside the utility to augment current generation, to plug gaps and lay the groundwork for alternative non-coal capacity in the future. In and of itself, this is necessary to give Eskom the time and space to fix. This would require us to be open in the interim to all low-cost energy supply that complies with existing laws on emissions and the like. Moreover, within Eskom's nuclear ambit, we would support the life extension of Koeberg and recommend a fleet of foot watching brief on global developments in the international nuclear power sector. In terms of policy, as Gwen has alluded to, and expressed in more detail in the policy statement which has been released, we would additionally and in parallel facilitate the emergence of what is called prosumers, where customers of electricity may also generate renewable energy into the grid when they have a surplus, and remove restrictions and incentivize the uptake of rooftop solar for residential purposes by granting a once-off tax rebate. To address all consumers, we would seek to eliminate illegal connections with an amnesty period for all households with an illegal connection, while instituting innovative measures to address cable theft and ongoing illegality. This is not rocket science, and this needs to be done. Importantly, the DA would unbundle and restructure Eskom. Commercially viable power stations should be sold to private owners and operated until the end of the remaining life of the station and beyond as practicable, heralding a move to privatization in an area where the state has patently failed. Our policies champion a diversified, competitive generation sector, which could include a number of independent generation companies, comprising former Eskom generators, new private-public partnerships, generators, municipal generators, IPPs, and distributed generators who are embedded on customers' premises or wheeling power through the grid to end consumers. This would require a rationalized electricity distribution industry built around former Eskom and municipal electricity distributors. Opening up distribution to private-public partnerships would help address the key issues being faced, such as chronic lack of investment, skills shortages, financial management, and billing. Improving the energy efficiency would also help to alleviate pressure on distribution grids. The remaining transmission entity of Eskom should become a national state-owned entity, an independent transmission system and market operator that has power planning, procurement, contracting, grid system and electricity market operation functions under its aegis. Additionally, the creation of an independent transmission entity will make it easier for the transmission entity to raise much-needed capital. With regard to Eskom specifically, our plans and policies are not out of kilter with the plan presented by the CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, to top CEOs just the other day on the 29th of July. Much of it is what we have been proposing for a long time and are pleased the penny, as it were, has dropped finally. We would, however, rule out any further bailouts in any shape or form and seek to accelerate instead private sector involvement on a competitive basis and address innovatively the country's needs and the ability to supply these needs more than adequately as laid out in our policy document. In short, we would fix the immediate issues at Eskom, restructure and unbundle the utility open the entity to private and sector to private investment that will end the state of monopoly that Eskom currently has, and deal with the concomitant issues in transmission and distribution as laid out, and secure our energy future. Mindful of our international, at the same time mindful of our international and global commitments, as well as our lagging status as an emergent market and as an emerging market that needs to keep electricity flowing in an affordable and available way now and in the future. That seeks to facilitate cheap electricity and fuel and end rolling blackouts. In sum, this talks to access to electricity for all and the important issue of reliability to effect this. I thank you.
Thank you, Caleb. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In line with our global commitments, we need to ensure that South Africa makes its fair contribution to reduce global warming. South Africa can and must improve its nationally determined contributions. In this regard, we need to ensure strict compliance with minimum emission standards and take decisive action to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. The declining cost of renewable and storage solutions means that even with the need to resolve immediate supply and our status and challenges as an emerging market, it is possible for South Africa to meet its energy demands affordably and reliably while contributing its fair share to keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. As part of our move to a fossil-free future, we need to ensure nobody is left behind. A just energy transition towards lower carbon technologies requires reducing the risks faced by people who might be most adversely affected. It includes workers, poor communities, and small businesses. According to the Minerals Council of South Africa, the coal mining industry alone accounts for approximately 170,000 indirect jobs. The coal industry is also frequently a source of contracts for small businesses in local coal-dependent areas. For example, according to one study in the Steve Tshwete municipality in Mpumalanga, 57% of businesses in the area provide services to either coal mines or coal power plants. There needs to be a clear transition plan that will upskill and reskill former coal sector workers, as well as reducing barriers for community-owned projects to compete. If we look at a broader energy source analysis, it is our position that we need to be source agnostic. In other words, and when I say source agnostic, in the short to medium term. In other words, not concerned with how electricity is generated, so long as it complies with legislation and regulations. This will aid planning and investment decisions at a high level. However, where state resources, whether financial or otherwise, are implicated, we need to ensure that these are committed to environmentally sound and sustainable projects. I'm now going to provide a brief overview of the DA's position with regards to various energy sources. So with regard to coal, we propose adopting a watching brief on international developments in the fields of clean coal technologies, underground coal gasification, and carbon capture and storage. We commit to phasing out new coal-fired power stations in South Africa in a planned, phased program as alternative, cleaner, and more sustainable sources of electricity generation come online. We totally reject any move to use state resources to fund new coal power plants. As far as gas is concerned, our policy recognizes that natural gas is at best a transitionary, non-renewable, hydrocarbon-based energy carrier. We therefore need to move and to accelerate South Africa's move to local or regional production of renewable green hydrogen, green ammonia, and other green hydrogen-based derivatives, both for export and for local use, rather than the use of imported natural gas. In the interim, We must allow private sector development of infrastructure for production, importation, and distribution of liquefied natural gas, compressed natural gas, and liquefied petroleum gas, only to the extent that this is necessary, economically viable, and unsubsidized by government. The DA supports an incremental and risk-averse approach to further exploration of natural gas through hydraulic fracturing, which is commonly referred to as fracking. Small-scale, strictly controlled, and responsible research and investigation should be done into fracking. Once sufficient knowledge has been obtained on the issue, a more informed decision can be made regarding further gas exploration in the Karoo and other parts of South Africa. As my colleague Caleb Kachalia noted, we support the life extension of the Koeberg nuclear power station following the expiration of its operating license in 2024. The DA is concerned, however, that the life extension project has been delayed, and this is likely to affect Koeberg's licensing beyond that 2024 timeline. Our position supporting Koeberg's life extension is in recognition that South Africa and Eskom have 30 years of successful experience in the operation of the power station and have significant scientific, engineering, and operating resources to do this. We also support the replacement of the Safari 1 nuclear research reactor with a new multi-purpose reactor, as that current reactor has reached end of life. The DA, however, is of the firm belief that South Africa must set aside ambitions for new nuclear power generation plants in the short and medium term, and, as Caleb indicated, monitor developments in the nuclear sector, such as the development and commercialization of small modular reactors, new generation large nuclear reactors, and nuclear fusion technologies. In order to enhance and facilitate our move to a sustainable energy future, we must upgrade and enhance our energy storage capacity. We must explore and encourage further commercial application of conventional energy storage technologies for power systems, including hydroelectric power, surface and underground pumped water storage systems, gravity-based potential energy storage, flywheel energy storage, molten salt, and gas storage facilities. At the same time, we need to facilitate, encourage, and incentivize the development and commercial application of emerging technologies for utility scale and distributed embedded energy storage in power systems, including battery energy storage, fuel cells, and supercapacitors. Lastly, we need to incentivize and facilitate the dual use of electric vehicles, cars, motorcycles, taxis, buses, and trucks for both transportation and as a source of distributed energy storage for own use or generation of electricity into the distribution network at times of peak demand. As far as liquid fuels are concerned, the DA has been very vocal over the past several months regarding the impact of fuel pricing on the cost of living. We have repeatedly advised government to cut fuel taxes by scrapping the general fuel levy and enabling tax refunds for road users with third-party liability insurance. In addition, we have proposed, and we have submitted a private member's bill to this extent, that fuel prices can be brought down by deregulating the entire value chain. In light of policy commitments to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, South Africa must ensure that the exploration and prospecting for new oil and gas is managed according to strict environmental regulations and monitored accordingly. We support the natural move towards further imports of refined liquid fuels, recognizing that crude oil feedstock is imported anyway and that South Africa has very little refining capacity at present. Our fuel storage and distribution infrastructure is in a sorry state. We must improve and build new storage and distribution infrastructure to ensure that South African facilities can handle the importation and export of oil products across the value chain. The Democratic Alliance therefore supports the decarbonization of the transport sector away from oil, diesel, petroleum, kerosene, and coal and gas-based liquid fuels through the encouragement and incentivization of a gradual move away from internal combustion engines to fuel cell and battery-powered electric vehicles, and the local production of renewable hydrogen-based power fuels for cars, trucks, buses, and trains. To do this, we propose significantly reducing the tariff on electric vehicles. In conclusion, South Africa needs a competitive energy market where the state does not have a monopoly on energy generation, supply, and distribution. We need to end rolling blackouts once and for all and ensure that every South African has access to cheaper electricity and fuel. There must be a multiplicity of private suppliers competing with one another to provide the best service and lowest price. This requires making it easier for energy suppliers to enter and participate in energy markets. Our ambition for South Africa is that energy should mainly come from renewable sources in the long term. However, we recognize that our longer-term plans will be influenced by the success of short-term measures to deal with the immediate and ongoing risk of load shedding. This is our vision for giving power back to the people, powering growth and development in South Africa. I'm now going to hand you back to Siviwe.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Ladies and gentlemen, as per usual, we are now going to be taking questions from the floor and from our online platform. If you can introduce yourself, your name, and the publication that you represent, or the media house. So I've got three questions already that I have here that I will allocate accordingly. The first one, Kevin, if you can please just handle this one. The question is from Kristen from the Cape Argus. What is your response to the President's energy plan? And how does the DA's energy policy differ from it? Gwen, right at the beginning of the press conference, did indicate and sort of outline exactly what are some of the key differences between our policy and the ANC's policy. But Kevin, perhaps you can just give more detail around that. Then question from Carol Payton, News 24. I think, Khaleb, if you can please handle this one. You say no more bailouts for Eskom. What should be done then about the 400 billion Eskom owes to lenders and bondholders? How would Eskom fix its plant without more resources? How would it borrow and expand the grid? It obviously can't borrow with all this debt. Secondly, how would it attract buyers for power stations given the poor state that they are in without further investment, which of course needs resources? Then the last question that I will take before I open to the floor here, to Gwen, about how does the DA's policy affect poor households in particular? A lot of mention is made about independent power producers. How does it affect poor South Africans? So if I could please just have Kevin, Khaleb, Gwen, and then I'll take the round on the floor.
Thanks, Siv. So the question was, what is our response to the President's energy plan? And let me start by saying that a lot of what the President said comes straight out of the DA playbook. It's what we've been saying for years and years and years. And it's gratifying that our inputs are finally being heard. However, we remain concerned that there are no milestones. There are no key performance indicators or targets that are being put in place. There's no timeline that says this is when we will accomplish this by. For this reason, the DA will be establishing, and in the next couple of weeks we will put it on our website, an energy tracker where we will be looking at the promises that the President made and tracking his government's delivery against those. I also want to highlight some of the things that were brought out in yesterday's briefing by the various ministers in, for want of a better word, the energy cluster. One of the things that was raised was by Minister Patel, and he said that they were going to reduce the requirement in the various renewable energy independent power producer programs from 100% local content requirement to 35%. Well, the question has to be asked, if we are in an electricity crisis, why have a local content requirement at all when we know that the South African manufacturing industry cannot meet the demand that is required to deliver that energy? The second thing that was indicated, Minister Gordhan spoke about buying additional electricity, surplus electricity from independent power producers, from SADC and the like. And again, one has to ask, well, why are you only doing it now? What prompted a wake-up after 15 years of load shedding? So the DA acts with urgency. We've put in place at a local government level. City of Cape Town has been doing a lot of work. Stellenbosch municipality has been doing a lot of work to be independent of Eskom and less reliant on Eskom. But equally to make consumers who put, for example, rooftop solar panels on their houses, to make it more affordable for them, to make it easier for them, to incentivize them to do that. And this is something that we would like to see rolled out across the whole of South Africa. So those are some of the differences between what the President proposed and what the DA is proposing. But that's our response to the President's energy plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Caleb?
It's a good question from Carol Payton, but I think we have a cogent answer. Let me say at the outset that she's quite right. We oppose any further bailouts from Eskom. The level of bailouts in rand terms over many years has been eye-watering, and it would be extremely foolish to continue to fund and pour good money after bad. Like any company, when we're talking about fixing and funding, like any company, you must fund via revenue and tailor your suit accordingly, which is why we have championed the need and possibility for the sale of power generative units that sit within the utility to the private sector, who will fund ongoing generation and fixes off their balance sheet and not impose any further on the public purse. Those sales, the revenue focus on the bird in the hand that Eskom has, truncated and tailored, needs to address the debt issue. And when it is done responsibly, in addition to dealing with the huge and implausible levels of staffing in Eskom, out of kilter with any utility anywhere in the world, so there's cost cutting which needs to be done, then people who are in the funding environment will look at Eskom, will look at Eskom's paper for funding with a very different view. This will take time and is only possible with what we have proposed. Thank you.
Thanks, Caleb. How is it relevant?
Yes, there was a question about how is it relevant for poor South Africans. Well, I mean, in short, the entire suite of policy proposals is geared towards providing cheaper and reliable electricity, but furthermore, to ensure that this is done in a sustainable way. And often this is missed because I think conversations around global warming and climate commitments can seem like an elite conversation, but actually poor South Africans or poor communities tend to bear the brunt of environmental pollution, etc. So that's the first point, to say that the entire suite of policies is geared towards cheaper and reliable and sustainable electricity. But perhaps I understand that some of these are more medium-term and long-term goals, and there could be a question about in the very short term, so many of the interventions have been geared towards IPPs, solar rebates, which of course imply a tax-paying household. So what will be done about poor South Africans who may not be taxpayers? I think the first thing is to say is that solar PV installations should be also looked at in terms of social housing, and any state-funded housing benefits should seek to include, wherever feasible, solar PV as well. But also I think the most critical point, which is what was mentioned earlier about the underserved indigent households in terms of free basic electricity. I mean, not to sound like Ramaphosa, but it is shocking. I mean, I know of course it was reported on, but I think far more should have been made and should still continue to be made about the fact that approximately 80% of South Africans who qualify for free basic electricity do not in fact receive free basic electricity, even though it is being funded by Treasury. So something is happening between municipalities receiving funding from Treasury for free basic electricity and what is actually dispersed for free basic electricity to households. I mean, that on its own would obviously play a part, and I don't believe any small part, in addressing the proliferation of illegal connections, because it is almost no wonder, not to excuse criminality, but in these dire circumstances, no wonder if close on 80% of South Africans who cannot afford electricity and who are supposed to be receiving free basic electricity are not in fact receiving it. This must place a heavy burden in terms of the problem that we face of illegal connections. So that is really a priority step that we will be taking to ensure that municipalities, including where we govern, account for how many households does Treasury cover and support for free basic electricity and how much is actually being spent in that regard. And we believe, not that there are too many silver bullet solutions when it comes to energy, but I think this one comes about as close as you can to a single solution that will play in a very important role, especially for poor households.
Thank you, Gwen. I'm going to now take questions from the room, and we will have to have another round for online questions. And just for everybody's information, we have just recently heard or received a statement from Eskom explaining that there might be a possibility of stage 2 rolling blackouts later on today. And again, I think it underscores the urgency of why a policy that seeks to provide reliable and cheap electricity is quite important. Any questions? I'll start with Paul at the back.
Hi, good day. Paul Vecchiato from Bloomberg. The incentivizing households and to have solar panels and PV generation. Eskom have, in their latest tariff application, been talking about a surcharge applied to that of about 900 Rand. What is your response to that? And considering mine as well, with prepaid electricity meters here in Cape Town, the municipality has put a 200 Rand surcharge on those. So you get, before you even pay your electricity, you got an extra. And that is part of it. Utilities always trying to shore up their revenue as due to declining usage. That's the model. And then secondly, in your plan, you don't talk about organised labour, which is a very real stakeholder in all of this. You know, for instance, they flexed their muscles a bit a few weeks ago with that strike. So in your plan, how do you plan to deal with stakeholders such as organised labour, and if you sell the plan to them, is there any kind of and how to accommodate their concerns? Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Paul. Lulu.
Good morning, Lula Mamaja, SABC. Just for clarity, you're talking about establishing a separate department or something to deal with energy, not attached to minerals. Is that what you are proposing, that energy must be a standalone? And what do you think then about a bloated cabinet if you say energy must be a standalone, must be separated from minerals? Secondly, on the illegal connections, has the DA maybe established how much percentage the illegal connection take from the national grid? Thanks.
Cool. All right. Let me stick to these three just so that we don't lose each other. Can I ask you, Caleb, to the surge charge? Okay. So Kevin, you'll deal with surge charge. Will you take organized labor? Surge charge, and if you can also deal with the separating of minerals and energy. Yep. And then if you can deal with organized labor, and perhaps one of you must reflect on the illegal connection question. Thanks. Cool.
Thanks, Paul. The tariff surcharge. So I think we need to understand how this works. It gets a little bit complex, but bear with me. So there is, in Eskom's tariff proposal, a 218 Rand connection fee to the grid. That's been there all along. What they are proposing is a 720 Rand tariff for fixed costs. Now, as you use more of Eskom's electricity, that 720 Rand would reduce. So let's say, and they baseline it on a 900 kilowatt hour household usage. So let's say you used 450 kilowatt hours, that's half of the 900 kilowatt hours, you'd pay half of that 720, so you'd pay 360 plus the 218 Rand. The challenge here is that you're being charged for something that you're getting no benefit from. The grid connection, that's one thing. But to pay for all of Eskom's back end and the rest of it, that becomes problematic. Have one charge, don't have a floating charge for those other fixed costs. To the second part of your question, in the city of Cape Town, there is a charge for feed-in meters and grid connection. Absolutely, exactly the same as with Eskom. Because you are paying for the municipality to provide you with a backup to your electricity supply. They've got to maintain the infrastructure, same as Eskom does. They've got to have a transformer and substations and the like. They've got to have a grid connection to you that is reliable and safe. So there is a grid connection fee in for solar users who are connected to the grid. Pay back the money, I like it. Yeah. There is also a meter reading fee. Now, I am informed that Mayor Jordan Hill-Lewis is looking at those tariffs, and hopefully there will be some announcements in the near future about what what's going to happen going forward in the city of Cape Town. But one of the things we need to look at as a country is a baseline for feed-in tariffs. We need to look at a baseline for grid connections, because we've got different municipalities charging different rates. We've got Eskom charging different rates. And so we need to make sure that there's some kind of standardization, that whether you're in the city of Cape Town or if you're in Cedarburg, you're paying more or less the same in terms of a connection fee for electricity. So I hope that answers that question. With regard to the separation of the Department of Energy and Mineral Resources, what we find is that there tends to be an overconcentration for a period of time by the department and or the portfolio committee in Parliament on one aspect or another of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. And so for 6-9 months, you'll be running around after the gas amendment bill or something like that, and very little attention is paid to other aspects of the portfolio. By separating the two, much more focus on sorry, this was Lulama. Yeah. Much more focus on energy, and given that we are in an energy and electricity crisis, that's where we need to pay a lot more attention. It does raise the concern about a bloated cabinet and a bloated executive. You're quite right. However, we have so many deputy ministers who add no real value to the South African government. Let's scrap those deputy ministers. Let's scrap some of the departments, amalgamate some of the departments, but energy for the short to medium term needs to be a standalone department to give that necessary focus to resolving South Africa's electricity and fuel crisis for that matter.
I think there was a question on organized labor and how would it be included. I mean, I think the main proposal in this regard that we have is this establishment of a ministerial advisory council, which fundamentally should include labor. It is different from the presidential various task teams and commissions in that, it being at a ministerial level does ensure greater accountability and transparency through Parliament, which currently we do not enjoy with many of the presidentially appointed working groups and task teams, etc. So that would be one way, obviously, to more meaningfully include them. And as we saw before with relative or with varying degrees of success during COVID, when there are ministry advisory councils where it is clear who their members are advising on a topic, especially if there's accountability through Parliament, they'd be able to make much more meaningful contributions and also to really question the ministry when the advice of those ministerial, when the advice of the Ministerial Advisory Council is not being followed. Obviously, the Minister and the Cabinet are still in charge and not an advisory body, but I think if you're going to have or take a stakeholder approach in that way, their advice should be meaningful as opposed to merely recommendations that one can consult. If the advice is not going to be followed, there should be clear reasons as to why. But also, we would want to note the fact that we've welcomed actually the approach from many unions who are involved in the industry in their openness towards embracing a fossil-free future and moving towards renewables. We think that the sticking point primarily with unions has been the issue of, well, yes, they embrace the transition, but how are we going to ensure that workers are not left behind? And this really shouldn't be too difficult a battlefield, considering that we agree with unions that there should be a plan in place to ensure that workers are upskilled or reskilled. So the absence of a plan is really what we see as an absence of political will, as opposed to the absence of any solutions about what it is to be done, or an absence of a meeting of the minds. There is clearly, at least in the DA's part in our policy proposals, a meeting of the minds with the unions about the need to have an inclusive transition. The only question is about implementation, and if we were in government, of course, we'd be in a different position, because we take movement in that on that issue very seriously. On illegal connections, I mean, there's, as I was saying in the beginning, there's just been so much research and discussion documents on energy that I know for a fact that that information does exist, at least on some level. It may not be to the extent that you would like, but happy to look and provide that. I don't know offhand, how much electricity illegal connections are costing the grid, but I do know that research has been done in this area, and we should be able to find an answer to that. But there was another. That was the. Was that all? Sophie?
No. That's all. I'll just give the next question in the next round. All right. I'm still going to take some from the room. The privileges of attending a press conference in person. Monique
Mortlock from ENCA. The country and its citizens, I think, are when we're just looking at what people are saying on social media and just the ordinary South Africans who we speak to, they are tired of hearing plans and policies and all of these government officials talking about all these things that they're going to do to end load shedding. So realistically and practically speaking, how is the DA going to be implementing many of its policies, especially, I know that, I think it was last month, the DA submitted its fuel deregulation bill, but things like the decarbonization of the transport sector, the not using state funds for the creation of new coal power stations, even tackling the illegal connection problem, because even in the city of Cape Town, it's such a massive problem in areas like your Philippi, Langa. You see all of these illegal connections in a DA-run municipality, and you wonder, how will a policy change anything? So that's my question, just the practical steps in implementing the policy.
All right, cool. Thank you. And let me take the two that I got online. It's Carol again. Khaleb, I'll direct this to you. Monique's question, if I can direct it to...
Yeah, I'll do a bit of it.
Okay, all right, okay, cool. Carol is asking, what is your view on contracting a power ship in the long term? And then Zaylene is asking, what would be the specifics of the amnesty period be, and what would happen to those consumers who fall behind that amnesty? Perhaps Gwen, you can reflect on that amnesty period issue. I think with Monique's question about implementation of policy, Kevin, if you can also just deal with particularly around the fuel issue. All right, cool.
So, Monique, thank you very much for the question. I think we've already shown that the DA is committed to making sure that we deliver on what we say we're going to do. And we do that. The example is the fuel deregulation bill. We said we were going to address the over-regulation of the fuel sector, the anti-competitive nature of the fuel sector. And so we have pushed that, and we are pushing a private member's bill through Parliament. But equally, from an electricity perspective, we're doing the exact same thing where we govern. So the municipality of Stellenbosch has been rolling out its own plans to become far less reliant on Eskom for electricity supply. And they are actually seeking independence from Eskom. So they're seeking alternative sources of energy, so they're not reliant on Eskom at all. City of Cape Town has gone out to tender for independent power producers. I believe the city of Ekurhuleni signed IPP power purchase agreements with 46 IPPs last month. So a lot of what we are saying is already being put into action by DA governments where we govern. With regard to the illegal connections issue, quite rightly, one of the things that we have to do before we can do all of that is put in place an amnesty period to say, come and register and say, I've got an illegal connection, I want to be legalized. At the same time, it places a burden and an obligation on municipalities to address that issue and put in legal connections. But that needs to be done because it's costing municipalities a fortune to maintain their own distribution infrastructure, so the transformers and the substations that are blowing because of these illegal connections. And yes, there is a loss of electricity through illegal connections, but equally, government is financing free basic electricity through the indigent grant process. So those municipalities, if the person is registered as an indigent and they have a legal connection, the municipality will get funded for them. So there needs to be proper processes put in place to register the indigent person, to connect them legally, and make sure that they are getting the services that they deliver. The last issue that I'm going to address is the issue that was raised by Carol about the car power ships. Let me stress that right now we have an electricity crisis. The DA would not support any long-term contract for emergency power procurement. We are looking at a short-term emergency power procurement, less than 5 years, probably in the region of a 1 to 2 year contract. Now, that may mean that we pay higher prices, but it also means that we are that much more flexible and able to supplement our own generation without relying on outside sources at exorbitant costs. So I hope that answers that question. Caleb, over to you.
Thank you, Monique. Our policies are forward-looking and are documented, and you've heard the thrust of it. As Kevin says, and as you all know, we are facing an immediate power crisis, and you've said quite rightly that people are bling, bling, bling of it all. However, this immediate issue and how we address it is not necessarily, because of its utter immediacy, embedded in our forward-looking policy statements. But it is addressed in our statements and our written letters to the President and to the Department of Public Enterprises, where we have unambiguously called for an independently managed state of disaster to be declared and to be answerable in terms of oversight to parliamentary procedure and an ad hoc committee set up to do that specifically. We have made this plain. Instead, government has housed it in the presidency where command and control exists. We have also called for a permanent electricity commission to be instituted. This is not new. Many countries do it across the board, and that deals with the immediacy of the crisis currently. And as I said in my initial address, our response to the immediate crisis will, of necessity as it unfolds, inform how we are going to deal with the broader issues going forward. I hope that gives you some sense of where we're going. Thank you.
Before I touch on the amnesty period question, I also just wanted to add my thoughts or reflect on the policy question about, all of these policies and plans are all very well and good, but what about implementation? I think it's very important that whenever we consider policies or looking at policies to understand they're deeply connected to implementation. So we often think of them as isolated. Okay, so there's policies and then, there's separately implementation. But often the policy failure leads to directly why there's implementation failure. So firstly, there's a great amount of disagreement between the president, ministers, and some of the comments we're hearing out of the ANC policy conference about the policy direction. Now, if you don't understand which direction you're pulling in, whether that has to do with the nature and extent of Eskom restructuring, whether that has to do with your climate commitments, if you can't decide on the policy direction, then of course you don't know what to implement, because you would implement different things depending on the policy stance that you have taken. And part of the presentation that I gave was to highlight quite clearly what are the policy choices the DA would make versus the policy choices the ANC is making. Another reason is that policy speaks quite deeply to implementation as well, is around, for example, the ANC's policy choices around BE, cadre deployment, etc., which lead directly to the hollowing out of institutions in terms of skills and competency. So even whether you're talking about the policy direction or the skills and competency we have to implement the correct policies, we are failing on both fronts directly because of the policy choices that were taken at the beginning. So policy choices are not distinct from implementation. They are part and parcel and an important part of ensuring that there is effective implementation. The other question about the amnesty period, I think that should be left largely to local governments to determine. But again, in trying to illustrate this continuity and working together between what the DA as a political party and what our leaders in government are doing, Tswana has actually announced an amnesty program for residents who are illegally connected. They are saying it will be run for 2 months. So obviously, we're not saying that's the gold standard. Other municipalities may choose a different time period. But the idea is that it is costing municipalities enormously to have illegal connections. Meanwhile, free basic electricity is supposed to be funded from the fiscus. So it is far better for municipalities to say, please come forward if you have an illegal connection and you qualify, than for you to continue to be on an illegal connection. So we really do think that if this program is taken up by residents, that we should see really large improvements in terms of the problem of illegal connections.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I think if there are no other questions, we've got Paul. Paul, I'll give you one last bite for the day.
Just quickly, on the buying of electricity from neighboring countries, any thoughts about that?
Okay. All right. Okay, cool.
Careful. Paul, thanks for the question. We've been buying electricity from neighboring countries for years. We've been buying electricity from Mozambique, from the Cahora Bassa Dam, for many, many years. And I think the first time we went into stage 6 load shedding in December 2019 was because of the failure of the power line from Cahora Bassa to South Africa. We are a part of the South African power pool, and we buy and sell into neighboring countries on a regular basis, depending on what electricity we have available or we require. What's interesting to note is that one of the major supply contracts, being a Zimbabwean supply contract with Mozambique and Zambia, I believe, expired a couple of days ago, and they are now trying to renew that, but they have issues with payment. And so there might well be surplus power available for South Africa to purchase from Mozambique and Zambia, and that's something that we absolutely encourage at this stage. Anything to address the shortfall of electricity, keep the lights on, and help our economy recover, because every day that we have load shedding is costing us billions and billions of rand. So.
Thanks, Kevin. And colleagues, and so that is our plan, and that is really the plan to essentially end load shedding and to make sure that we provide cheap fuel and electricity. And I think Monique's point was a very important one about how South Africans have grown very tired of plans. But that's why we also make these interventions in Parliament. We contribute to the plans that the ministers have. And that's also why we are starting to try and insulate many of our residents where we govern from Eskom and Eskom's and national government's failures. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a lovely afternoon.